Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of Hopefully Interesting. I'm back again with the, I want to call you the Buddha of Babel, but that it comes to the top of my brain because that's somebody else's nickname. So I'll have to think of something else, but, um, you know,
It'll be something good,
right?
I'm
Hopefully.
sure. I have faith in you.
So, again, I am Joseph Pavlenko here with my co host and sword expert supreme. At least,
Mark Derica.
right? At least in the context of
The
all the
two of
people,
us.
the two of us and our lightsaber fighting fellows. Today we're going to talk about some sword fighting stuff as we do. We're going to be kind of picking out the differences between modern and historical sword fighting. And to kind of do that, I know it's something Mark wanted to break down, which is the idea of what is a martial art. That's kind of going to be the foundation we're going to try to build this house or set this argument up on, I guess. So,
Right, yeah. So, you can break martial arts down into a lot of different sections. And we can talk philosophies and traditions and cultures and all of that kind of nonsense for what we're talking about today. So today we're going to break martial arts down into really four categories, 4.5-ish. And that being martial sport, dance, self-defense, historical / modern martial arts. So to kick it off with martial sport, and this is something that we're going to touch on a little bit more later, but it's the idea of, are you doing combative stuff? Yes. But is it a sport? Also, yes. Things like this is, a lot of the times it's going to be more how you're approaching a tradition or a system or whatever you want to call it. But things like HEMA could be a martial sport. Things like Olympic or competitive karate, competitive taekwondo, boxing, things like that of that nature, things that do use martial principles but are primarily sports by nature. And I think MMA is going to be probably the prime example of it, or UFC, where are you using martial arts techniques? Yeah, sure, but is it about the sport? Yes. And like boxing, like Floyd Mayweather is a really good example of it. He is a really quick boxer and he scores a lot of points, but if he was set up against an opponent of equal skill, so like the Conor McGregor fight, I know had some controversy, but what McGregor was doing was a little more martial arts, whereas Mayweather plays the game. So are they both using valid techniques? Yes. But one just happens to score more points. And so you can even argue fencing in that category, although fencing's gone a little farther in the sport category. I would argue that it's not martial anymore, really. And you can lump a lot of different things into that category. Anything where the school or the instructor or yourself are focusing more on the sport rather than what the art was originally intended for. So like fencing, obviously saber. We'll talk about saber because it's the easiest, right? So Olympic fencing saber comes from practicing military saber, with gymnasium sabers and Italian dueling sabers as they've become known by. And those were closer to the actual weapons. And originally, when the Olympic fencing rules were devised, it was still really close to that original art, although it's been bastardized through the generations. And you have to be very skilled for fencing. I'm not discrediting anyone who does fencing. They're awesome athletes, but they're not really what I would determine as martial artists, although it could fit into that category. Yeah, so I mean, you have a little bit more experience on the boxing end than I do. I don't know what your experience was with that.
So on the boxing side, I agree with you where it leans more towards the sport. And kind of what got my head at least thinking about this is you and I quite often have a conversation, mostly while playing For Honor or watching fights about, this is a great technique, but in the game that we play with the Saber Legion, would this be awesome? Yes, but the way the game's set up, it wouldn't work. Back in the day, would it help you be the one that's not laying in a bloody heap on the ground? Probably. But again, with the game we play and it being to the touch, it doesn't have a place in some of the sports we play, right, with the Saber Legion and that kind of stuff. I think that's the same for boxing. If you were, a lot of people call it a sport or the sweet science, and from that aspect, I would even say boxing is more sportified than UFC, I almost kind of think, because you're putting two guys in a ring and saying fight, but don't kick them. And don't do a lot of things that you would do in an actual fight.
Don't bite their ear off.
Yeah, UFC gets a little closer to that, but it has still been sportified or gamified because people can do more and have more tools at their disposal. But as you see most UFC fighters, they either box or they do kickboxing, and they have some kind of ground game, most of them. Either dabble in jiu-jitsu or do some kind of wrestling, because those are the combinations of skill sets that have proven to be the best or the most effective. You don't see people coming in doing karate or sumo wrestlers or anything like that showing up and fighting in the UFC like they did when the organization first started, because people very quickly found out what works well, and what helps get me home. And for most people, it's what helps get me home at the end of the day with less damage, because the less
and a lot of money.
Yeah, and the less damage you take, potentially, the more you can fight. So
right, definitely. And yeah, with that, I would really say that anytime you include rules, it's a martial sport. It's no longer martial art in the original sense, at least.
Yeah. I know some people can say, oh, during war, there's rules and that kind of stuff and rules of warfare. And it's like, yeah, kind of like, don't, mustard gas people. But if Mark, breached my door right here, came in and needed to, take out me as a threat in the room, he would probably very quickly turn, if he doesn't put a bullet in my noggin, probably do lots of not nice things like eye gouges. And
as long as you don't stab him with the tri-pointed bayonets, right? You're good when it comes to hand-to-hand combat. Yeah, no, definitely. How you take out a threat in war would be very different than how you would fight an opponent in the ring, and it should be, because otherwise we're going to run out of fighters real quick.
Yeah, and that's what we see when we're talking about my chair bumped. That's what we see with modern versus historical stuff, right? A lot of the things, a lot of historical techniques, stab them good, hit the hands, hit the forearms, make it so they can't hold a sword. And does it work now? Yeah, but you have quite a few people that they don't like it because it isn't as cool, it isn't as fancy, or they think it's
what they saw in the movie.
it isn't showy techniques, it isn't deep to the body. I mean, there's a million things I've heard just in the lightsaber community of why
Oh,
you
yeah.
should be striking deeper into the body versus the more forward facing targets like the hands or stuff that is closer to the opponent.
Right. I've heard the same complaints in the HEMA community as well. Complaints about people cutting too far up the blade because there's a misconception that, yes, the point of percussion, so Matt Easton has a really good video on it, but generally it's about a third of the way up the blade. And it's essentially where the most force will be transmitted into the target. But you can cut real well with most swords up at the tip, the first 3 inches of it. So there's a lot of people who, his strike was it was too tippy, right? And that's kind of utter crap, being that it would still cut, it would still do damage. It might not take off a limb, but it would still do something, right?
Right, and depending on the source and the period, and what kind of rapier you're using, that might be the only part of the rapier that you can cut with, because that might be the only part of your rapier that is actually sharp.
Right, especially the later period rapiers. But also, I mean, especially with the rapier, it's real light at the tip because the mass distribution is further back towards the balance point. And so you're accelerating really quickly. You're not going to get through thick clothing, but if you hit someone in a fleshy bit, it's going to come off probably with the top 3 inches or so. Depending on the rapier, and rapiers vary a lot more than most swords. But yeah, no, definitely. But you can see it in Fiore's Flower of Battle, right? Where he talks about wrestling. Now, if you take modern sport wrestling, a lot of the techniques in Fiore would be very frowned upon. But in Fiore's manual, most of them are, okay, I'm not going to put you in a lock or hit pressure points because I don't care about you submitting, but I'm going to shatter your elbow. I'm going to hit you as hard as I can in this joint to make it break. Or I'm going to shove you face first into the dirt and then stab you with whatever I can, or punch in the back of the head if needed, although that's a little bit of conjecture. Yeah, so I mean, you take modern wrestling versus historical wrestling. People, yeah, especially in Germany, you get some people who are wrestling for sport, but most of the manuals out there that deal with wrestling are talking about wrestling in self-defense, where you're trying to kill your opponent.
So, martial sport. We kind of talked about the game we played.
And we'll get back to that.
Yeah. Boxing
in the context of sword stuff.
Yeah. Boxing and other stuff. And I think I agree with you. If we kind of sum it up, I think something being a martial sport means you're playing for points, not for lives, obviously. And there's structured rules that the goal is to make the game safer. Because if we are playing for keeps, we don't care how safe the game is. We care how safe we personally are. And those are choices we make in the techniques that we execute. But in the context of playing a sport, we're trying to make everybody participating as safe as possible.
Right. No, definitely. So the next subject would be dance. And this is probably the most inflammatory subject of martial arts.
Maybe. It's something that frustrates me to no end. Being somebody who has a great-great-grandfather that or having a family that came over from Russia and having a great-great-grandfather that growing up being told he was a Kazakh, went to the World Fair. Somebody in my family has pictures of him doing his fancy horse riding tricks and stuff like that. And it's frustrating to me because something that would be a historical link to my family, relevant to a hobby of mine, sword fighting, really hard to find any kind of martial art manual on. It seems a lot of it is almost like what Richard Marsden did with Polish Saber. It's kind of historical martial art archaeology. And I know some
Right.
people want to say that, oh, the art of the Russian saber, the shashka, that's a saber without a guard, because Russians made very interesting decisions. But on
Hopefully they're
Cossacks,
wearing nice thick leather gloves.
right? I was cold. They probably wore lots of things.
Right.
But that's been distilled down to what people call sword dancing, and some people like to teach a lot of those moves and those flourishes and a lot of this kind of motion with moving the sword. And being somebody reading manuals you've recommended and watching stuff on YouTube and watching Rapier and Knightly Combat and a lot of other things, just it's dancing. I don't care
Right.
what you say. It's not really martially sound, and when you're doing this, I'm gonna do that.
Right.
So
Yeah, definitely. And and it's not just a Russian thing either. You see it in Korea, you see it in India, you see it in a lot of cultures. This idea of dancing with the sword. Now, I mean, there's psychological reasons that promote it. There's a bunch of reasons for it. But it, at the end of the day, is meant to look pretty, maybe meant to be good exercise, which is always a good thing. But it's not meant to kill your opponent. So, I mean, something like capoeira, a lot of people talk in defense of that. And while a lot of the techniques could be valid if you set it up properly, at the end of the day, it's a dance. It will never be as efficient as some of the other moves.
yeah, and I think some of it might even be. I could be wrong. And again, if I am wrong, please let me know. Gotta find the right side in the comments. Let me know. I confused Mark there for a second.
A little bit.
Correct me. But I've even read, to the extent, at least in the context of like the Kazakhs, that some of it was the Communist Party took over, didn't like them
Right.
so much. So the way that they were able to try to hide or conceal their martial tradition was, oh no, this is a dance we do. This dance is part of our culture. And allegedly, they've snuck techniques in there. But then it kind of, as you like to say, now we haven't written anything down, and now we're playing a game of telephone. And what's to
Right.
stop one person from interpreting this move as this is the martial move, and somebody else goes, oh, no, this is the martial move. And after a certain amount of generations, it's just a dance, right? I mean,
Right.
you play telephone
And
enough, and
things get bastardized and lost.
Yeah.
And you lose the original meaning of it. And on the note of telephone, that's one of the reasons that I like HEMA, is because we're studying historical manuals. So we might not have the original meaning of it, but we have what the master said, right? Whereas most, like Japanese, especially, traditions are just a game of telephone. But also, to pick on the Japanese again, and I don't mean to, but it's a good example that most people in sword fighting are going to be familiar with. But you have things like Aido, right, or Aijitsu, or whatever you want to call it, that is dance, 100% dance. Now, do they cut tatami? Do they do that kind of stuff? Yes. But really, it's dance, because it's pre-choreographed routines that flow together, and they're not reaching an end goal. And that is what I'll probably establish as the determining factor for this dance, is the end goal is the dance. Now, you can always say, yeah, the end goal is to be a better swordsman or whatever, but without a competition or without actual practical application in some way, it's a dance. I started in a martial art called Kukso Won, and which is a Korean martial art, and they had forms, which were good exercise. They were meditative if you did it right, and I'm sure they helped people make that mind muscle connection of how to flow from one one technique to the next. But at the end of the day, it wasn't for sparring. So that to me is a dance, or at least that portion of it. So things like the Kazakhs, right? It might have started another way. It might have started is maybe they decided to make forms to teach people how to flow from one cut to the next, like Hutton's Milanese, right? But if there's no end goal of fighting, which theoretically, in most cases, there isn't anymore, right? If there's no end goal of fighting, then what's the point, right? It's a dance. And I'm not trying to bash on any of these martial arts, but we're just trying to establish common terms, so we can all discuss the same thing. And my co-host over there is dying.
I am. That drinking the water earlier, tactical error.
Right.
Now I have a tickle in my throat that I can't get rid of.
I hate that. But yeah, so anything more to add on that?
I don't think I have much else. I think we have lots of conjecture on why the dance might be useful and why the martial art may be veered towards the dance. But without any kind of written source, I don't think we'll ever have the actual intent. Because again, most of these, it's been a game of telephone. And it's the original meaning and intent, we can hope, has survived through the ages. But if you've played telephone in elementary school on a rainy day in your classroom, you know how quickly, either by nobody's fault or because you have somebody who, just wants to goof off.
Watch the world burn.
Right. How quickly something can get misconstrued.
Right.
But yeah, I think Mark said everything on it. I think I've said my thoughts on dance. Moving on to our next thing, which would be self-defense, which is something, as we planned this episode, we kind of knew we'd have some things that double dip.
Right.
Mark was saying he thinks boxing can kind of be that self-defense. If I'm misquoting you, yell at me, please. Can double dip in martial sport and martial defense, and I think that's true. As long as martial sport and self-defense, boxing can double dip in those, I think, definitely.
Yeah.
But it falls apart the second somebody brings out a knife or any kind of weapon.
Right.
I think.
I think. Go ahead.
I think some techniques in the UFC are maybe applicable for those kinds of techniques because UFC also teaches grappling. So you know how to isolate a hand and do a joint lock and maybe get the guy down into a position where you can put him in an armbar or something. And going back to Fiore, that's where we shatter the elbow. Because if his elbow shattered, he can't really use the knife in that hand.
Right.
But then I would say UFC falls apart in a self-defense kind of situation the second somebody pulls a gun on you. Because
or a bigger knife.
Yeah, because once you get to self-defense, it's self-defense against what? And there's a level of escalation that happens. And I had a friend who had a really cool idea for a comic book. And it was basically the guy... I think they even made a trailer of it somewhere on YouTube. But it's this kid, his sister gets married, wants revenge, learns martial arts, goes to fight the gangsters, they pull a knife, gets cut up. All right, cool. I need to learn how to use weapons. Comes out with a pipe, messes up the guys with a knife, gets shot. He's like, all right, there's a lot more to this than I thought. Can't be Batman in a week.
Right.
So it's levels of escalation and how you deal with it. So self-defense against what, right? And I'll let you take it away because I've been dominating the time, waxing poetic on this.
No worries. No, I think you hit the nail on the head. And with what is it, what are you defending against? Which is going to come down to your region, your country, the laws in your country, how much the criminals in your country are paying attention to those laws, which is probably minimal.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of factors that can be in play with this one. But at its core idea is just, defense of yourself or other people. So I would lump in concealed carry classes for like pistols, That is definitely a self-defense martial art, which will double dip in what we're going to be referring to as modern martial arts as well. But I think boxing is going to be the core of most of these, because ideally you don't want to go to the ground. Because if you go to the ground, and how many times have you watched the UFC fights where the one guy tackles the other guy or joint locks him or whatever, tries to bring him to the ground, and the wrong person ends up on top, or in an advantageous position.
Right.
And what if that were...
Sorry, I was going to say, or they have friends around the corner. Now you're
right, or they have friends around the corner. Or you go for the joint lock and they stab you instead. Or you go to grab their hand to manipulate that joint, and your hand goes hand first onto their knife, and now you're out of hand. Yeah. Although, I mean, there's theory on how to deal with that, but that's not the topic of this video. But yeah, so I mean, self-defense should be something that goes from best case scenario to worst case scenario. Best case scenario being you can talk your way out of the situation. If your self-defense class doesn't start with some kind of philosophy or communications theory or something like that, then I suggest looking for classes elsewhere. Although if you're taking a gun class, that's a little different because things have clearly escalated beyond a point of talking. But I would say the best self-defense classes would be a communications and kind of philosophical class, and then it would escalate to boxing, then boxing against someone with a knife, and then maybe knife versus knife, and then maybe knife versus gun, then gun versus gun, which is kind of what Fiore did.
Right, and I was going to say, I think something else that could maybe double dip, and I'm going to go old school on this reference, but self-defense and martial art, Fabris, because back in the day, I would say it's probably a martial art, but it's also self-defense in a duel, right? Fabris's goal, much like modern self-defense, is trying to make sure you're the one that makes it home at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. A lot of the rapier, not so much small sword, but some of the rapier manuals out there are definitely self-defense. If you look at something like Joseph Swetnam's manual, then it's self-defense when he gets to like the walking stick. Although with the rapier, he's more talking about dueling itself. If you look at Hutton's Cold Steel, he talks about the use of dagger and great stick, both things that theoretically you might have on you. You might have a large knife for self-defense or for work or just as a tool, but you might have a stick either with you or nearby. Maybe you have a cane, maybe you have a large stick. Bartitsu is another good example of an old school kind of martial art or self-defense art. So yeah, that would be self-defense because you're using your cane to defend yourself and others. So yeah, I would say, as a definition, it's looking at perspective, and the perspective of you're being attacked. How do you defend yourself? Pretty much, like there's a lot of examples, but like Krav Maga could be. It's another one that double dips, and we'll get to in a second. But Krav Maga is a self-defense. We mentioned karate earlier in the context of a martial sport, but depending on the context that you're training for, it might also be a self-defense class or self-defense system.
Right, or the roots of it even, right? We have a mutual friend, and he talks about karate is what they taught the common folk as a way to get them ready for war when the lands were under siege. So back in the day, within the context back then, was maybe a martial art, and maybe, again, through playing that game of telephone,
right?
What has been passed down, or what is generation by generation by generation has been chosen to pass down, or whatever is stuck. That's what's created modern karate. That and the fact that it is a sport now, so again, we are going to probably optimize for the sport because people are competitive and people want to win.
Right. And that specifically is Okinawan karate as well. Just to add into that. But yeah, no, definitely. A lot of these things, like we see HEMA, a lot of the HEMA manuals are either martial arts or they were or self-defense or to win a duel, which I guess you could call self-defense, although it's premeditated self-defense. But a lot of them started off as that, and now they're martial sports because they're, unless you're living in Texas where you can open carry a sword, they're not very practical for self-defense.
We need a move.
Right? You need to move to Texas. Now, there's a lot of people I don't like in Texas. But yeah, no, I would love to live in an area I could open carry a sword. As more of a fashion or status, not status, but more of a I just want to carry a sword thing. I do not think they're practical for self-defense unless your opponent only has a knife. And if your opponent or the person mugging you or whatever only has a knife and they see that big old sword on your hip, they're probably not going to mess with you too much.
Yeah. You talked about Krav Maga and that being
Right.
something else that double dips. And that's something that double dips between self-defense and actually considered a martial art as well, right? Or at least by what you and I are deciding within the context of the argument or the conversation we're having, what we're deciding to call a martial art, right?
Right. And just to, since we're at the historical and modern martial art part of this conversation, just to clarify for everyone, we're using the dictionary definition of martial art, which is if you look up martial and you look up art, it's going to give you something akin to martial being of or related to the war god Mars or warlike, and then art being a performance or action. So a performance or action related to the war god Mars or related to warlike nature. So that's kind of the working definition that we're going off of. And you don't have to agree with that. No one has to agree with that, and that's fine. You can have your own definition. But unless we can establish commonalities in definition, there's no point in having a conversation.
Right. To take the train a little off the rails, I defined athlete in a similar way to what we just defined martial arts within the context of a group I'm part of and talking about sports, calling esports people athletes, because you break down that word and essentially it breaks down to somebody who competes for a prize. So within that definition, they're competing for a prize, which would make them athletes. Much to my dismay, the rest of my group decided that I was wrong and I was outvoted. But this is our show, and within the context of our show, yes, like Mark said, you may disagree. You can let us know in the comments how you disagree and why you think we're wrong. But for the argument we're making, this is the framework of the argument that we have.
Right. And the dictionary is a perfect way to deal with that because it's not based on my opinion. It's not based on Joe's opinion. It's not based on the viewer's opinion. It's based on what is black and white in the dictionary. And dictionaries are slow to change. Now, yes, there's an argument to be made for evolving definitions and stuff like that, but that's again a different conversation, and one we're not going to be getting into on this video. Maybe later, if you want to see that video, let us know in the comments.
Right. So martial arts, I know I kind of jumped into Krav Maga, but I know you wanted to talk about some historical stuff. Might be easier to start at the past and take us to the present.
Right. And so we kind of hit on Fiore earlier as a self-defense, also theoretically a martial art, because he does talk about at the end of the manual, he talks about mounted versus mounted, mounted versus unmounted, and obviously most of the manuals unmounted versus unmounted. But he talks about weapons of war and things like that. George Silver, love him or hate him, does talk about weapons of war and how to use them. But another great example of it that both of us have looked into fairly recently is Pringle Green's manual on naval, or that deals with naval cutlass.
Yes.
But the bulk of his manual is dealing with the rest of the boarding action between two ships, whether it's use of boarding spear, boarding pike, whatever you want to call it, use of pistol, formations to have your sailors in to defend or attack other ships. And that would typify, or that would be typical for me to be a martial art. It's something to be used in warfare. So like Pringle Green, it's Navy, but it's still warfare. If you want to talk about, or if you want to get together with some reenactor buddies and stand in a line and load and fire muskets, learning to load and fire under commands could be considered a martial art. Now that's a historical martial art because things that aren't done nowadays, but it is a martial art nonetheless. Things that aren't martial arts, to me, in my opinion, is learning how to use a katana. That's not really a battlefield weapon. Would you carry it onto the battlefield? Yes. But is it a martial art? No, because it's not a weapon of war. It's in the same sense as a officer nowadays going on patrol with his platoon or her platoon in Iraq or Afghanistan and carrying a pistol as a sidearm. Is it a weapon of war? Arguably no. But are they using it in a military context? Yes. So is learning how to shoot an M9 a martial art? And that's where the gray area kind of is, because it's, again, getting back to the context that you're using it in. So is the self-defense side of Kenjutsu, learning how to cut down peasants in the street, is that a martial art? No. Using the same techniques to cut down someone else in armor on a battlefield, is that a martial art? Maybe. Yeah, sure. But so like using a rapier on foot against another person in a duel, is that a martial art? No, not by the working definition we're using. But the same rapier used on horseback in a battlefield situation, is that a martial art? Yeah, sure. Theoretically, at least.
Yeah, and I would say both the rapier and the katana probably fall into the category for what we've established them as self-defense weapons. Within the context of both weapons, you hear lots of duels.
Right.
And like you said, whether it's premeditated self-defense or it's true self-defense, it's still being used primarily in that scenario or within the context of that situation.
Right. And you can perform self-defense on a battlefield. Does that make a martial art? To me, it depends on the original context that you learned the thing in. Obviously, if you're learning to fight on horseback with a rapier, that's probably you're learning to go into battle with under those conditions. Whereas if you're learning to use it on foot in a duel and you just happen to go into combat and pull a rapier on someone, is it a martial art? No, not really. It is an action related to war, but the art itself, it's a gray area, you know. But that's kind of the working. That's the point of a working definition, is we can add to it and subtract to it as we go. But yeah, I mean, I think to me it really is about the context you originally learned it in. So, is a long sword self-defense? Sure. Is a great sword self-defense? Maybe, if you have some really angry friends. But, you know.
Well, and you were saying, so an M9, like a pistol, works
Mhm.
as self-defense, could be used in an act of war. So it's that weird kind of gray area. But then we have something else that's self-defense and martial art, which before the program we talked about uh, Krav Maga. Now, does
Right.
that to you at least, does that fall into that same gray area?
Yeah. Well, the gray area or double dipping, you could say. Yeah. So moving into the modern martial art, because I feel like throughout this whole video we've kind of talked about the historical martial arts side. So modern martial arts, you could look at something like Krav Maga, and it's really going to come down to the context in which you're learning it, right? So if you're part of the Israeli Defense Force and you're learning Krav Maga, it's a martial art because you're learning how to use that in a war setting. If you're learning it down at your local community center for self-defense, then it's clearly self-defense, even though it could be the exact same techniques. And so that's kind of the weird gray area, or depends on how you're viewing it answer, right? The context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it could also be a UFC scenario almost, right? Like within
Right.
the martial art context of it, within the Israeli Defense Force context of it, we're going to teach somebody this really, really mean arm joint lock and then leads into a kick at the knee that shatters their knee, and now they can't walk, and now they're they're an easier prisoner to manage.
Right.
Um, whereas a self-defense class, maybe we're not teaching people how to lock out an arm and shatter kneecaps because maybe
Right.
we don't want to give the average person that kind of power.
Right. And I mean, really, Krav Maga is just kick them in the nuts and run away, right? But, yeah. And then if you taught it to an MMA fighter without the breaks, obviously the breaking of the joints or limbs, then they used it in the ring. If they learned it specifically for use in the ring, maybe that's a martial art, or maybe that's a martial sport. So it's kind of that gray area. But you have things like MCMAP, so Marine Corps Martial Art Program. It's something that I didn't really get much out of, but I had to do when I was in. It's 100% a martial art because you're learning how to detain prisoners. You're learning how to use a knife. You're learning how to take hits while wearing body armor. You're doing a lot of running and weird exercises in armor. And so it is a martial art because it talks about bayonets and larger knives in the context of using it in a warfare setting, right? So there aren't many techniques in MCMAP, or at least that I learned, where you go to the ground because you never know what's around the corner, as brought up earlier. There are a lot of techniques where you send your opponent or enemy to the ground, but most of them are standing, because if you can stay standing, you can win the fight. If you go to the ground, you're probably not winning an actual fight unless it is one-on-one in locked rooms with no weapons. Essentially a sporting context. So MCMAP, Army combatives, whatever they teach the Navy and Air Force, I'm not sure. It's probably a joke, but whatever. I was a Marine, so I got to throw in the jabs when I can get them. Things that they're teaching the Royal Army or Royal Marines, same thing, right? It's probably going to be a martial art 99% of the time. Is there one, former Marine that got out and now he's teaching MCMAP or a version of it down at his local YMCA? Maybe. I don't know. Hope not. But maybe, sure. Or maybe a McMap instructor taught their spouse in order to provide self-defense for their spouse. So in that case, yes, it is a self-defense thing because they're learning it as a self-defense. But I mean, also if a Marine went into the ring for MMA and they did McMap, one, they'd probably get disqualified, but two, they would then it would be a martial sport. So I think a good context is, or a good way to define it is, why did you originally learn it, or in what situation, if you will, did you originally learn it?
Right. I also think, as we've been talking, I think the difference of some stuff, at least to me, between, I'm not going to say dance so much, because that to me feels like something that started as a martial art and, like you said, was either forms or maybe it was a way of trying to preserve it. And we've just kind of lost the essence, the killiness of
The
it,
original
maybe.
intent.
Right.
The killiness. I like that. It's a science term.
But I think martial arts, when done competitively, become a martial sport. I think it's as time marches on, self-defense arts or self-defense systems maybe used to be martial arts, but now that we have
Guns.
pistols and guns and stuff, a lot of those old self-defense systems are now martial sport systems because they're not relevant as time,
Right.
like you were saying, definitions evolve. As time marches on, what something means, because what a definition means changes how we perceive it, or how we perceive it changes as time goes on. Was it back then? Probably, yes. Is it now? No, because pew pew.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can say the same thing about like HEMA, for example. Various, like, pretty much anything to do with a sword. It's not a modern martial art because it's not something that's being used in warfare. Although up until the early 2000s or mid 2000s, you could, as a Marine, you could carry an NCO saber into war. Although no one did it because that's real dumb. That's a lot of extra kit you got to bring along that no one would actually want to. Although, if I had to spend the money on a sharp sword, then sure. It's better than using a bayonet, in my opinion, in a lot of situations. But yeah, that's different topic.
I now want the story of the one Marine that brings that in his kit. The guy pulls the knife and he just has the saber, and the guy goes, "Oh, today's going to be a bad day."
Right. But I mean, yeah, no, I will use one saber to hook another saber, which is off screen. See if I can do it. Haha. And grab my NCO saber. So, I mean, it's not, as I knock everything over, right? It wouldn't be bad. Obviously, this is stainless steel, and it's not sharp. And I blunted the tip so I can stab my heavy bag with it. Because this was like a $50 thing, if that. But it's actually not far off of my gymnasium saber. It's a little shorter. It's actually based off a French saber. But yeah, I mean, and unfortunately you wouldn't get a really nice shinging sound because of the scabbard.
Well, but Hollywood likes to lie to us.
Hollywood, yeah. Well, I mean, they do, but not always. Because, for example, as I knock the camera, a little bit of it,
a little more, yeah.
Yeah, most of it on the way back in.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to play with this one too much because this one's actually sharp. Yeah, no, that would be fantastic if that had actually happened. Although, I imagine they would get in trouble for it. So, because you get in trouble for everything in the Marine Corps.
Anything fun, probably, right?
Everything fun. Yeah. Most things, but everything fun. but yeah, so modern martial arts, it's going to be something that's being taught to you for warfare purposes. Did I use McMap to keep a rather rowdy, drunk individual from doing something stupid? Sure, maybe. Arm bars are useful against drunk people. But was that the original context? No. So
Right, because I could even make a compelling argument that I'm an 18-year-old, never drove a car,
wish.
join the army, join the Marines or whatever, get into the tank corps. I've now learned how to drive a tank. So now the skill of learning a tank for me was taught initially in a martial art or a war situation. So it's how we choose to define these
Right.
things. Like kind of like we've been saying the whole time. It's the context and how the skill is being used and how the skill is taught and how the skill is intended. And mostly I think, at least what I've come to kind of think after having this discussion with you is um historical stuff. It's a historical martial art, and the people that practice it, the only way they can practice it is within a martial sport capacity. Whereas
Theoretically, I mean, they could fight with sharps.
they could, but then is it
It's not a good idea,
but
but
is it still a martial art within that context? Yeah, they're fighting. I would call that self-defense, like Fiore or Fabris, even maybe, because it's one-on-one. It's not battlefield, because that's not what a battlefield is anymore.
right.
Um, so yeah,
You
I
could
think
line up a bunch of people with pikes and practice some George Silver or something, and put sharps on the end.
you
I
could.
guess you could call that a martial art if you had enough people to declare war, I guess.
Get
I
the
don't know.
SCA on the phone.
Drop the numbers for the SCA real quick.
um, but at least that's kind of my takeaway. I don't know if you have a similar takeaway to this, or if you have anything you'd like to add. But kind of as, at least in my mind, as I think we're kind of winding down, that's my takeaway.
Yeah, it's sport. Or sorry, it's a context.
Yeah, and what used to be martial art, still practiced today, falls into the categories because time has marched on, and the way we wage war has, some people would say, become more efficient, or it's just changed. I would say guns are more
Right.
efficient than learning
Oh
to
yeah,
use and use a sword and a lot of that kind of stuff. So
most things are more efficient than learning to use a sword. But yeah, I mean, like it's down to the context. I guess if you're learning something like Pringle Green, for example, if you're learning Pringle Green and you never do sparring, you're learning it to learn it as the martial art was intended, and you're learning it because you're going on a ship or something. You might think it's useful. Then you could argue that it is a martial art still.
yeah,
But
I would. You dropped historical martial art a couple times, and I think it falls into that category. No matter how
right.
much you and I might want sword
Well,
fighting
I
to
meant,
still,
yeah. Well, I meant historical martial art. It would still be a martial art over a martial sport because you're not learning it to spar or compete with.
fair enough. Yeah, I would totally give that.
But that's, if you're doing that, I mean, just buy a gun.
Right.
Probably going to be a lot more effective on a ship. But I mean, I think we should bring back cutlasses at least, because they would be effective in a ship. I mean, those Navy ships are really close quarters, although I haven't heard of one being boarded by like a boarding team in a while. I imagine, once we get spaceships, then they'll be nice and cramped quarters, like the ISS or the or various Navy ships that we have. So it'd be cramped quarters. So maybe you could use a sword or a cutlass or something to a good degree.
A space cutlass.
Space cutlass. I mean, it'd be interesting. You wouldn't be able to use gravity to assist you. And I imagine you'd want it made out of something lighter because it costs so much money to get stuff into space.
Right.
So
Maybe a
you'd
blade made out of
probably want
plasma.
blade made out of plasma. See, I wouldn't like that because one malfunction inside of it, or you're drifting because we're not using artificial gravity theoretically. So sword fighting in 0G would be interesting. Imagine a lunge.
Oh, God.
So that would be, that would be interesting. Because the plasma, like, what if you are fighting someone and so you've clicked on your plasma sword and you're fighting someone and they knock it out of your hands and goes flying through a wall and opens up a vent into space. Or you mismanage your height and you go to cut at your opponent and it hits the ceiling above you and cuts a hole in space. Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why plasma swords in space are a horrible idea. Even worse than like cutlasses in space. But I think cutlasses would be a little more effective because you could easily block and still hit. And being that you're in 0G, you're probably going to accelerate the tip rather quickly and be able to cut pretty efficiently. I think we found a topic for another episode.
I think we did. Space cutlasses, space sword fighting.
Space sword fighting.
I mean, Space Force will be a thing soon.
Right, and so they'll need to learn how to march and drill with swords. And then there's sport fighting. Yeah,
and I think we I think we touched on most of those things, but I mean, we can kind of drill down a little deeper into it. I think it's stuff like some of the things we already talked about. It's boxing, I think, falls into there. Olympic fencing, I think we mentioned, and that kind of falls into that. And I think that's what happens when a martial sport becomes even more specialized. And like you've said, fencing is kind of the epitome of it because fencing has become so specialized. It is so far away removed from the art that it was designed to kind of emulate. It's almost unrecognizable.
Right. Yeah. And so in my mind, you kind of have three different categories, and to really help people picture what we're talking about is you have Olympic fencing, kendo, and HEMA. Olympic fencing being the most removed and HEMA being the least removed from the original sword fighting. Fencing, Olympic fencing at least, has just become so bastardized that I wouldn't even call it sword fighting anymore. It's far removed from the original source, especially with electronics and the flats of swords counting. At least with Saber, I believe it does. So things like, sport, like that kind of, like Olympic fencing is pretty far removed. And then you have kendo, which is kind of an in-between because the techniques themselves aren't far from what you would do with the sword. Maybe the timing and all of that, it isn't that far from what you would do with a katana. The problem is the rule set, right? So you still have a rule set which, under the context we established earlier, does establish it as a martial sport. But also, in warfare, you probably shouldn't yell out where you're going to hit right before you do so. In warfare, if you scallop a cut, or if your opponent gets their sword in the way but not enough, you could still kill them. There's no obviously there's certain places that are going to be more effective to stab or cut, but there's no illegal targets in real life. So, and I understand why these things are in place, but it invalidates it as a martial art. It is a martial sport, and more so than something like HEMA. With HEMA, they are actively trying to preserve the martial art aspect with their with non-standardized rule sets for tournaments, with weapons like being blunted and with safety tips, but it's still steel, which is something that Kendo's missing. It's still steel and performs and handles much like the real versions. Compared to, this is an English gymnasium saber compared to an American heavy cavalry saber. So, but it's a lot closer to the originals. Obviously, this isn't the original version of this, but it's a lot closer to the originals than a shinai is to a katana, right? So it's
We heard that.
no, you didn't. We'll just put that there and hope it doesn't fall over and cut anything. But yeah, so if they wanted to make Kendo into a more of a martial art, which I'm not saying they want to or should, but maybe using a steel katana, maybe removing some of the kind of silly rules that they have.
Right, and I think that's another thing we should say, and potentially putting out here as we're near the end of the show versus where
Maybe
probably should have gone.
I can talk forever.
Right, but as opposed to maybe we should have led with this, which is we're not being critical on anything because we're saying it's subjectively wrong. It's just a different way you can do it.
Right.
And sometimes within the context of Kendo's fine. People that practice
great
Kendo
exercise
don't think Kendo's broke, so why fix it?
Right.
So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I'm not trying to bash anything, right? But it's just different ways to think about things. This is a little more philosophical than some of our other videos.
Yeah.
And it's, again, just our opinions, but we think they're interesting and we want to share them. But other things like the SCA, specifically cut and thrust and heavy, or SCA. So SCA rapier, heavy and light, is definitely more of a sport than it is could be considered a martial art, because there's a lot more rules on what you can and can't do. SCA cut and thrust is more of closer to a martial art, because now you can actually percussively hit people, although there's still really restricting power limits and really subjective power limits, unfortunately, but that's a different conversation again. But I would say it's a little closer to that self-defense or martial art, and they do some group fighting with the rapiers, and they'll get out there with rapiers, or sometimes cut and thrust, from what I understand, and line up in a line, and they all walk forward and stab each other or whatever. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying, but so could it be considered a martial art or historical self-defense? Yes, very much so. So yeah, it's all kind of how you look at it. And then you have probably the closest thing to a martial art as sports gets, which are historical martial art as sports get, which is the HMB or ACSW. So historical medieval battles, armored combat sports, and armored combat worldwide. I think are the three main groups. I'm not terribly spun up on it. It's something that I'm interested in, but I don't want to get my head caved in.
Right.
It's honestly a little scary to me. But yeah, that's to me is a martial art, 100%. Maybe not so much when you're one-on-one, but the big, I think they had a 250 versus 250, 250 fighters versus 250 fighters, all in full plate armor, mostly plate armor, with various steel weapons going at it. And that is 100% martial, or 95%, whatever you want to call it, martial art. However, I mean, there's still a rule set. Granted, the rule set is mostly by submission, so but there's rules that you can and can't do, like no thrusting and things like that. So I would say, as far as martial sports goes, that's probably the closest we have to a martial art and a martial sport at the same time. But yeah, I mean, it's all context, right?
Yeah. I ran out of things a while ago to talk about. So, if you have anything else you want to contribute, all right.
I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Right. So we have plenty to talk about on future subjects, like space cutlasses.
Right, space cutlasses, and why we don't want to get our heads caved in, or why there aren't enough painkillers in the world to convince Mark and I to do armored combat, at least yet.
I don't know. If I had the armor and enough painkillers, I would do armored combat.
Give me a couple more years in HEMA and maybe a few more concussions, and I'll sign up for the armored combat league.
Right. If I had the armor that would make me satisfied with joining, then I would 100%. So maybe if someone's watching this at a future date and they're a blacksmith and want to sponsor a YouTuber to get into armored combat, I'm all for it. Let's talk. But obviously we don't have enough followers right now for that, but you never know, right?
Yep.
I would love to do it. I would probably end up wearing more armor than a lot of people.
That's fair enough. I mean, yeah. So I guess we'll land the plane here. Hopefully you guys thought this was interesting. Like every week, that is our goal, to hopefully be interesting, hopefully be a little entertaining, and hopefully be some level of informative and correct. Hopefully being correct. Being wrong all the time would be real bad. But if we misquoted,
be like being married.
Being wrong, or if we misquoted or missaid anything, again, drop something in the comments, let us know, educate us, because we like learning. We don't mind being told, hey, you did that wrong, because it means we get to read and maybe learn something new. Tune in, as always. Get these out every Wednesday. We look to continue doing that for the foreseeable future, because we like the sounds of our voices. I have been Joseph Pavlenko, joined with
Mark Carrico.
There we go. So thank you guys. Have a good rest of whatever time of the day it is. Morning, evening, night. See you next week.